I found the letter 3 days after Marcus's funeral, tucked inside a locked drawer in his mahome office desk. The key had been in his wallet, which the hospital returned to me along with his watch and wedding ring. I'd avoided that office for 72 hours, unable to face the space that still smelled like his cologne, and the leather chair where he'd spent countless evenings working on what he called his projects. But the lawyer needed Marcus's insurance documents, and I knew exactly where he kept them. The drawer opened with a soft click that seemed too loud in the silent house. Inside, beneath a stack of paid invoices and old tax returns, was a cream-colored envelope with my name written in Marcus's careful handwriting. Not my dearest Claire or to my beloved wife, just Claire, in black ink that had slightly bled through the expensive paper. My hands trembled as I picked it up, already knowing somehow that whatever was inside would change everything I thought I knew about my marriage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The envelope was sealed with red wax, theatrical in a way that wasn't like Marcus at all. My husband had been practical, methodical, the kind of man who labeled his files and organized his closet by color. This dramatic gesture felt wrong, like finding evidence of a stranger living inside the man I'd shared a bed with for 26 years. I should have opened it immediately, but something made me hesitate. The afternoon sun was streaming through the office windows, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air like tiny ghosts. Outside, I could hear Mrs. Chun from next door talking to her gardener about trimming the hedge that separated our properties. Normal sounds. Normal life continuing while I held something that felt anything but normal. I sat down in Marcus's chair, the leather creaking under my weight the way it used to creak when he settled in for the evening. The chair still held the impression of his body, still felt warm somehow even though he'd been gone for 3 days. My therapist would probably say I was avoiding opening the letter because I was afraid of what it contained. My therapist would be right. Marcus had died suddenly, a brain aneurysm while he was getting his morning coffee at the cafe on 5th Street. The barista said he'd been smiling, joking about the weather, and then he simply collapsed. Gone before the ambulance arrived. No warning. No chance to say goodbye. No opportunity to ask him why he'd written a letter that needed to be sealed with wax like some kind of confession from a Victorian novel. I broke the seal. The wax crumbled between my fingers, leaving red flakes on Marcus's desk like drops of dried blood. Inside was a single sheet of the same cream paper, covered in my husband's handwriting. The letter was dated 6 months earlier, written on our anniversary while I'd been at the spa enjoying the day of pampering he'd arranged for me. While I'd been getting a massage and a facial, believing my husband was home preparing the romantic dinner he'd promised, Marcus had been writing this. Claire, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you found what I never had the courage to show you while I was alive. I need you to know that everything I'm about to tell you, I did because I loved you. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth. I've been lying to you for 23 years. Not small lies. Not the kind of omissions that all marriages have. Real lies. The kind that built a foundation under our entire life together. The kind that means everything you think you know about me, about us, about the life we built isn't real. My vision blurred. I had to stop reading and press my palms against my eyes until I saw stars. 23 years. We'd been married for 26. That meant whatever Marcus had been hiding, he'd started lying about it just 3 years into our marriage. 3 years after we'd stood in front of our families and promised complete honesty. 3 years after I'd given up my career as a journalist to support his business ventures. 3 years after I believed we were building something real. I forced myself to keep reading. My name isn't Marcus Webb. It's Marcus Castellano. I was born in Philadelphia to Anthony and Rosa Castellano. And yes, Claire, they're exactly who you think they are if you recognize that last name. My father was what they call a made man. My uncle was worse. I grew up in that world, and by the time I was 22 I was involved in things that would horrify you. Things I can't write down even now, even knowing you'll only read this after I'm gone. I watched people get hurt. I helped make it happen. I collected debts that destroyed families. I did things that still wake me up at night sweating and sick with shame. The paper slipped from my hands and drifted to the floor. I couldn't breathe. Marcus Castellano. I did recognize that name. Everyone in the Northeast recognized that name. The Castellano family had been all over the news 15 years ago, when the FBI finally brought down their operation. I remembered sitting in our living room with Marcus, watching the news coverage of the arrests and trials. My husband had seemed fascinated by the story, asking me questions about mob culture like he was genuinely curious. I thought he was just interested in true crime. The entire time he'd been watching his own family get destroyed. I picked up the letter with shaking hands. When I was 24, I witnessed something I wasn't supposed to see. My uncle killed a man who was working with the FBI, and he made me help dispose of the evidence. I knew then that I had two choices: become the kind of monster my uncle was or disappear. So I disappeared. I went to a man my father once mentioned, someone who specialized in creating new identities for people who needed to vanish. It cost me every penny I'd saved, plus some money I stole from my uncle's operation, which was essentially signing my own death warrant if they ever found me. But Marcus Castellano died in a warehouse fire in South Philly in 1997. Marcus Webb was born the same night, with a complete history, a social security number, and a college transcript from a school I'd never attended. I met you 6 months after I became Marcus Webb. You were covering a story about small business development in Cleveland, and I was there pretending to be an entrepreneur with big dreams and a clean past. I fell in love with you immediately. The way you asked questions. The way you listened like every word mattered. The way you saw the world as something that could be understood and explained and maybe even fixed. You were everything my old life wasn't. You were honest and bright and good. And I wanted to be worthy of you so desperately that I convinced myself the lies didn't matter. 3 years into our marriage, my past caught up with me. Not the FBI. Not my uncle's people. But my mother. She was dying of cancer, and she wanted to see me one last time. She'd kept my secret all those years, never told my father or uncle that I'd called her once to let her know I was alive. But now she was dying and she begged me to come say goodbye. So I did. I told you I had a business trip to Pittsburgh. Instead, I drove to Philadelphia and spent 3 days in a hospice room watching my mother die, while holding a hand she couldn't squeeze back anymore. She made me promise her something before she died. She made me promise to take care of my sister Sophia. Your sister. The words hit me like a physical blow. Marcus had a sister. 23 years of marriage. And my husband had a sister I'd never met. A sister he'd never mentioned. A sister he'd been supporting with money that came from our joint accounts. Sophia was 16 when I disappeared. She didn't know what I'd done or why I left. She just knew her big brother vanished one day and never came back. My mother made me promise to watch over her, to make sure she was okay, to help her if she ever needed it. So I've been doing that, Claire. For 23 years I've been sending money to Sophia. Not much at first, just enough to help with her college tuition. But then she got married and her husband lost his job. Then they had kids and needed help with medical bills. Then her husband left her and she needed money to keep her house. Every time I sent what I could, and I told you the money was for business investments or charity donations or repairs on rental properties that don't exist. The rental properties. I'd done our taxes for the past decade, and I'd seen the deductions Marcus claimed for properties he said were in Cincinnati and Columbus. Properties that apparently didn't exist. Properties that were actually a cover story for sending money to the sister he'd never told me about. I thought about all the times I'd questioned those deductions, worried we might get audited. Marcus had always reassured me, showing me fake documents that must have cost him a fortune to create. The layers of deception were staggering. Sophia doesn't know where the money comes from. I set it up through a lawyer who handles everything anonymously. But she needs to know now. She needs to know she had a brother who loved her, who never forgot her, who spent 23 years trying to take care of her from a distance. The lawyer's name is Richard Chun, and his office is in Philadelphia. He has a letter for Sophia that explains everything, but only if something happens to me. He also has documents that prove where all the money came from, our money, Claire, because that's what it was. I stole from us to give to her. And I'm sorrier about that than you'll ever know. There was more. 2 more pages of Marcus explaining the specifics of his deception. How he'd created false business trips to Philadelphia so he could watch Sophia from a distance, making sure she was okay without ever revealing himself. How he'd attended his nephew's baseball games, sitting in the stands in a baseball cap and sunglasses like some kind of spy. How he'd been at Sophia's second wedding, sitting in the back of the church, crying behind dark glasses while his sister got a second chance at happiness. How he'd set up a trust fund for Sophia's children. My money funding the education of children I didn't know existed. How he'd planned to tell me everything on our 30th anniversary, convinced that by then I'd love him enough to forgive him. How he'd written this letter as insurance, just in case he didn't make it to that anniversary. The final paragraph made me close my eyes against the wave of grief and rage that threatened to overwhelm me. Claire, I know what I've done is unforgivable. I've lied to you every single day of our marriage. I've stolen from you. I've built our entire life on a foundation of deception. You deserved better than this. You deserved a husband who could be completely honest with you. But I was a coward. I was terrified that if you knew the truth about who I really was, where I really came from, what I'd really done before I met you, you'd leave me. And I couldn't bear that.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I loved you too much to risk losing you, so instead I lost myself in the lie. I became Marcus Webb so completely that sometimes I almost forgot Marcus Castellano ever existed. Almost, but not quite. The truth is always there. Claire, waiting in the shadows. And now that I'm gone, the truth is all that's left. I'm sorry. I'm so desperately sorry for everything. But I'm not sorry I loved you. That was the only real thing in all of this. My love for you was the only truth I never had to fake. If there's anything after this, I'll spend it hoping you can forgive me. And if there isn't, then at least I got to spend 26 years being loved by the most incredible woman I've ever known. Tell Sophia I'm sorry I couldn't be her brother in the open. Tell her I watched over her the only way I could. And tell her the money stops now unless you choose to continue it. That's not her burden to carry. It's yours, and you get to decide what happens next. I love you. I've always loved you. Even when I was lying, that was true. Marcus. I sat in that office until the sun set and the room filled with shadows. The letter lay on the desk in front of me. Marcus's confession glowing white in the growing darkness. My first instinct was to crumple it up and throw it away, to pretend I'd never found it, to preserve the memory of the man I thought I'd married. But I'd been a journalist before I became Marcus Webb's wife. I'd been trained to chase the truth, to follow leads, to never stop digging until I understood the real story. And this was the biggest story of my life, even if it was one I'd never publish. I picked up my phone and searched for Richard Chun, attorney at law, Philadelphia. His office was in Center City, a respectable address in a building that housed doctors and accountants and other professionals who probably had no idea one of their colleagues was managing the double life of a former mob associate. I called the number listed on his website, expecting to get voicemail after business hours. Instead, a man answered on the second ring. Chun Law Office. This is Richard Chun. His voice was professional, clipped. Exactly what I'd expect from someone who'd spent 23 years guarding my husband's secrets. Mr. Chun, my name is Claire Webb. I think you've been expecting me to call. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed, softened with something that might have been sympathy. Mrs. Webb. Yes, I've been expecting your call. I'm very sorry for your loss. Marcus was a good man who found himself in an impossible situation. That's one way to describe it. I couldn't keep the bitterness out of my voice. He lied to me for 23 years. He stole hundreds of thousands of dollars to support a family I didn't know existed. And apparently you helped him do it. I didn't help him lie to you, Mrs. Webb. I helped him protect his sister and, by extension, protect you. If Marcus's family had ever discovered he was alive, they would have come after him. And they would have come after you. What he did, creating a new identity and cutting all ties, that wasn't just about escaping his past. It was about keeping you safe from it. I wanted to argue, to tell him that safety built on lies wasn't real safety. But something in his words stopped me. Marcus's family. The Castellanos. I'd watched enough of that trial coverage to know what they were capable of. If they'd known Marcus had faked his death and was living in Cleveland under a new name, they would have considered it a betrayal. And they handled betrayal with violence. I need to understand everything, I said, my voice steadier now. I need to know exactly what my husband did, where the money went, and what kind of danger I might be in now that he's gone. Can I come to Philadelphia? Tomorrow? Mr. Chun hesitated again, and I could hear him typing on a keyboard. Tomorrow is Friday. I can clear my afternoon schedule. 2 o'clock? I'll have all the documentation ready for you. There's a lot to go through, Mrs. Webb. Your husband's financial arrangements were complex. Complex. That was certainly one word for it. I'll be there at 2. And Mr. Chun? Yes. Sophia. Does she know yet? About Marcus being gone? No. Mr. Chen's voice was gentle. I was waiting to hear from you first. Marcus left instructions that you should be the one to decide whether to tell her, and how much to tell her. He thought you'd earned the right to make that choice. I hung up and sat in the darkness of Marcus's office, trying to process what I'd just agreed to do. I was going to Philadelphia. I was going to meet with a lawyer who'd helped my husband maintain an elaborate fiction for more than 2 decades. I was going to learn exactly how much money Marcus had diverted from our life together to support the sister he'd never mentioned. And then I was going to have to decide whether to tell that sister the truth about who her brother had really been, and what he'd sacrificed to protect her. The house felt different now, like the walls themselves had been lying to me. I walked through rooms I'd decorated, past furniture we'd chosen together, surrounded by photographs of a life that suddenly felt staged. There was Marcus at our vacation in Maine, grinning at the camera with salt water in his hair. Marcus at his 40th birthday party, surrounded by friends who probably didn't exist before he became Marcus Webb. Marcus at my mother's funeral, holding me while I cried, offering comfort from a man who'd spent his entire adult life running from the truth. In our bedroom, I opened Marcus's closet and stared at his clothes, still hanging in neat rows organized by color and season. Everything looked normal. Exactly what you'd expect from a successful small business owner. But now I couldn't stop wondering which of these clothes he'd worn on his secret trips to Philadelphia. Which shoes had walked through his nephew's Little League games? Which jacket had he worn to his sister's wedding while sitting anonymously in the back row? I pulled out his winter coat and checked the pockets, not sure what I was looking for. I found a ticket stub from a restaurant in Philadelphia's Italian market, dated 3 months ago. Marcus had told me he was in Columbus that weekend, meeting with potential investors. Instead, he'd been in his old neighborhood, probably watching Sophia from a distance, making sure she was okay without ever letting her know he was there. The grief hit me then. Not the grief I'd been feeling since the funeral, but something sharper and more complicated. I was mourning my husband, yes, but I was also mourning the marriage I thought we'd had. The partnership I believed was built on trust and honesty. The life we'd created together that turned out to be half fiction. I sank onto our bed, clutching that restaurant receipt, and cried until my throat ached and my eyes burned. Mrs. Chun found me there an hour later. She'd let herself in through the back door, something I'd told her she could do any time after Marcus died. She'd been bringing me food and checking on me, performing the duties of a good neighbor with the dedication of someone who understood grief from personal experience. Claire. Her voice floated up the stairs, concerned. Are you home? I'm up here. I managed to call back, though my voice sounded wrecked. She appeared in the bedroom doorway, took one look at me, and immediately came to sit beside me on the bed. What happened? Did you get bad news from the lawyer? Worse, I said, and handed her the letter. Mrs. Chun read it in silence, her expression shifting from confusion to shock to something that looked like understanding. When she finished, she carefully refolded the letter and set it on the nightstand. Oh, Claire. I know. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. 23 years, Diane. He lied to me for 23 years. Mrs. Chun was quiet for a moment, her hand resting on my shoulder. Then she said something I didn't expect. My husband lied to me for 31 years. I turned to stare at her. What? Robert had a whole other family. A wife and 2 children in California that he'd never divorced before he married me. I didn't find out until after he died, and his other wife showed up at the funeral. So believe me when I say I understand exactly how you're feeling right now. I'd known Mrs. Chun for 8 years. Ever since Marcus and I moved into this house. We'd shared countless cups of coffee, helped each other with yard work, celebrated holidays together. And I'd never known that about her past. Why didn't you ever tell me? For the same reason your husband probably never told you about his past. She squeezed my shoulder. Shame is a powerful thing, Claire. It makes us hide the parts of our story we think will make other people judge us. But you know what I learned after Robert died and all his secrets came out? The people who really love you, they don't judge you for the terrible things that happen to you. They judge you for how you handle them. So the question isn't whether Marcus was wrong to lie. He was. The question is what you're going to do now that you know the truth. I looked down at the restaurant receipt still clutched in my hand. What did you do when you found out about Robert's other family? Mrs. Chun smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. I got very angry. I smashed every photograph in the house. I burned his clothes in the backyard. I spent 6 months being the most bitter, miserable person you'd ever want to meet. And then I realized something. Being angry at a dead man is like being angry at the rain. It doesn't change anything. It just makes you wet and cold and miserable. So I stopped. I sold the house Robert and I had shared. I moved here. I started over. And I decided that the rest of my life was going to be honest even if his wasn't. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile the man I'd loved with the man who'd written that letter. Marcus had been kind. He'd been generous with everyone except, apparently, when it came to the truth. He'd been my best friend, my partner, the person I told everything to. Except he'd been telling me nothing, or worse than nothing. He'd been telling me carefully constructed lies designed to maintain the fiction of Marcus Webb, while protecting the secret of Marcus Castellano. I got up at 3 in the morning and went back to his office. This time I wasn't looking for documents the lawyer needed. I was looking for proof. Evidence of the double life my husband had been living. If Marcus had been sending money to Philadelphia for 23 years, there had to be records somewhere. Bank statements. Transfer receipts. Something that would show me exactly how much of our life together had been sacrificed to support the family he'd abandoned. I found it in a locked filing cabinet hidden behind a false panel in his closet. The key was on the same ring that had opened the desk drawer. Inside were folders organized by year, each one containing bank statements for an account I'd never known existed. An account in the name of MW Consulting, funded with money transferred from our joint accounts in amounts small enough that I'd never noticed them missing. 500 here. 1,000 there. Over 23 years it added up to more than $400,000. $400,000 that could have been our retirement fund. That could have been the down payment on the beach house I'd always dreamed of owning. That could have been security and freedom and the kind of life where money wasn't something we had to constantly worry about. Instead, it had gone to Sofia Castellano, now Sofia Romano according to the documents, to her mortgage payments and her children's medical bills and her life in Philadelphia that had nothing to do with me. I spread the statements across Marcus's desk and started calculating. In 2006, he'd sent $15,000, marked as a loan in his careful handwriting. That was the year I'd wanted to go back to school for my master's degree, and Marcus had convinced me we couldn't afford it. In 2011, another $20,000, the same year we'd postponed our anniversary trip to Italy because of unexpected business expenses. In 2015, $35,000, which coincided exactly with the month I'd suggested we finally start trying for the baby we'd been putting off. Marcus had said the timing wasn't right. Now I knew why. He couldn't afford to support a child with me because he was already supporting children in Philadelphia. The betrayal of it was staggering. Not just that he'd lied, but what he'd lied about. What he'd taken from me to give to them. I'd sacrificed my career to support his business ventures. Businesses that apparently generated enough profit to send hundreds of thousands of dollars to Pennsylvania, while I clipped coupons and worried about our mortgage payment. By the time the sun came up, I'd gone through every folder in that cabinet. I documented every transfer, every lie, every moment when Marcus chose Sofia over me. And I'd made a decision. I was going to Philadelphia, but not just to meet with Richard Chun. I was going to meet Sofia Romano. I was going to look her in the eye and find out exactly what kind of person was worth $400,000 of lies. The drive to Philadelphia took 6 hours, and I spent every minute of it rehearsing what I would say to Richard Chun. By the time I reached Center City and found parking near his office building, I'd written and rewritten the speech in my head at least 20 times. None of the versions felt right. How do you confront a lawyer who helped your husband maintain a secret identity for 2 decades? How do you demand answers when you're not sure you're ready to hear them? Richard Chun's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building that reflected the afternoon sun like a mirror. The lobby was all marble and chrome, the kind of place that whispered money and discretion. I gave my name to the receptionist, a young woman who looked at me with the practiced sympathy of someone who'd been briefed on my situation. She led me down a hallway lined with abstract art to a corner office with windows overlooking the city. Richard Chun stood up from behind his desk as I entered. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 50, with silver hair and the kind of face that gave nothing away. He gestured to a leather chair across from his desk, and I sat down, clutching my purse like it might anchor me to reality. "Mrs. Webb, thank you for coming." His voice was the same as it had been on the phone, professionally sympathetic but carefully neutral. "I have everything prepared for you. Before we begin, I want you to know that Marcus left explicit instructions about what I should and shouldn't tell you. However, given the circumstances, I'm prepared to answer any questions you have, regardless of what his instructions were." "You've been helping him lie to me for 23 years, I said, and my voice came out harder than I'd intended. "I think we're past the point of following his instructions." Mr. Chun nodded slowly, as if he'd expected exactly this response. "You're right. Marcus asked me to help him protect his sister, and to keep his past identity secret." I agreed because I believed he was genuinely trying to escape a dangerous situation and build a better life. But I also told him repeatedly that he should tell you the truth. For what it's worth, he always said he would. He was just waiting for the right time. The right time, I repeated. 26 years of marriage and he never found the right time. Mr. Chun opened a thick folder on his desk and pulled out a stack of documents. "These are all the financial records. Every transfer Marcus made to Sophia, every dollar that came from your joint accounts. He was meticulous about tracking it all. I think part of him always knew you'd find out eventually, and he wanted you to have a complete picture when you did." I took the documents and started flipping through them. The amounts were even larger than I'd calculated from the statements I'd found at home. Marcus had been even more generous than I'd realized, sending money not just for emergencies but for birthdays, holidays, graduations. He'd essentially been a ghost father to Sophia's children, providing support without ever revealing himself. "Tell me about Sophia," I said, looking up from the papers. "What kind of person is she? Does she have any idea where this money came from?" Mr. Chun leaned back in his chair, considering his words carefully. "Sophia is a good person who's had a difficult life. She's a nurse at Jefferson Hospital, works night shifts to make ends meet. She has 3 children, ages 19, 16, and 12. Her first husband was abusive, and she spent years getting away from him. Her second husband, Tony, is a good man, but he had a stroke 2 years ago and can't work anymore. She's been the sole provider for her family for a while now." "The anonymous benefactor story," I said. "She really believes that?" "She believes it because it's the only explanation that makes sense." Mr. Chun pulled out another folder and showed me copies of letters he'd sent to Sophia over the years, always on plain stationery with no return address. The letters explained that a family friend who wished to remain anonymous wanted to help her. They were carefully worded to be kind but distant, offering support without creating any expectation of a relationship. "Marcus wrote most of these himself," Mr. Chun continued. "He'd draft them and send them to me, and I'd rewrite them to remove anything too personal. It killed him that he couldn't just talk to her, couldn't be her brother openly. But he was terrified that if he revealed himself, his uncle's people would find out he was alive. Are they still looking for him? Even after all these years?" Mr. Chen's expression darkened. "Marcus's uncle, Vincent Castellano, died in federal prison 8 years ago. Most of the organization was dismantled during the trials. But there are still people out there who remember Marcus, who might hold a grudge about the money he took when he disappeared. More importantly, there's the issue of what Marcus witnessed before he left. The man his uncle killed was an FBI informant. If it ever came out that Marcus had witnessed that murder and never testified, never came forward, he could have been charged as an accessory. So he spent 26 years looking over his shoulder," I said quietly, "living in fear that someone would recognize him or that the FBI would figure out who he really was." "Every single day," Mr. Chun confirmed. "He had nightmares about it. He told me once that he'd wake up in cold sweats, convinced someone was coming for him. That's why he was so careful, why he maintained the Webb identity so thoroughly. It wasn't just a cover story. It was survival." I thought about all the times Marcus had seemed distant or distracted, all the moments when he'd flinched at unexpected sounds or seemed nervous around strangers. I'd attributed it to stress from work, never imagining he was carrying the weight of a completely fabricated identity. Now I want to meet her, I said suddenly. Sophia. I want to meet her and I want to tell her the truth about who her brother was. Mr. Chen's expression shifted to concern. Mrs. Webb, I'm not sure that's a good idea. Marcus specifically requested that Sophia never know his real identity. He thought it would be dangerous for her to have that information. Dangerous how? If Vincent Castellano is dead and the organization is gone, who exactly is she in danger from? From the truth itself. Mr. Chen leaned forward, his voice intense. If Sophia learns that her brother faked his death and has been alive all these years, she's going to have questions. She's going to want to know why he never contacted her, why he let their mother die thinking she'd lost him. She's going to be hurt and angry, and she's going to want answers that might lead her to dig into Marcus's past. And if she starts asking questions about Marcus Castellano, someone might notice. I stood up, suddenly unable to sit still anymore. You don't get to make this decision for me. Marcus doesn't get to make this decision for me. Not anymore. He's gone, and I'm the one left dealing with the consequences of his lies. If I want to tell his sister that he spent 23 years watching over her from a distance, that he loved her enough to sacrifice his own happiness to keep her safe, then that's my choice to make. Mr. Chan studied me for a long moment, then reached into his desk drawer and pulled out another envelope. This is the letter Marcus wrote for Sophia, to be delivered only in the event of his death. He never specified who should deliver it or when. He left that decision to me and by extension to you if you insisted on being involved. I'm insisting, I said, taking the envelope. The address was in South Philadelphia, in a neighborhood called Pensport that I vaguely remembered hearing about. Working class, traditional, the kind of place where families stayed for generations. The kind of place Marcus Castellano would have grown up in before he became Marcus Webb and moved to the sterile suburbs of Cleveland. What does the letter say? I asked. I don't know. Mr. Chen's answer surprised me. Marcus sealed it before he gave it to me. He said it was private, between him and his sister. All I know is what he told me, which is that it explains who he was and why he left. I looked down at the envelope in my hands, Sophia Romano written across the front in Marcus's handwriting. The same handwriting that had covered the letter I'd found in his desk, confessing to 23 years of lies. The same handwriting that had signed our marriage license, promising to love and honor me. The same handwriting that had maintained 2 separate lives with apparently equal commitment. I'll deliver it myself, I said. Today. Mrs. Webb, Mr. Chun stood up, alarm clear in his voice. Please think about this carefully. Once you open this door, you can't close it again. Sophia's life will change forever. Your life will change forever. Are you really ready for that? I thought about Mrs. Chen's words from the night before. The people who really love you don't judge you for the terrible things that happen to you. They judge you for how you handle them. I was tired of being the person things happen to. I was ready to be the person who decided what happened next. I'm ready, I said. Give me her address. Sophia Romano lived in a narrow row house on a street lined with American flags and Virgin Mary statues. The house was well maintained but showed signs of age, the kind of place that had been in a family for decades and would stay in the family for decades more. I sat in my car across the street for 20 minutes, watching the house and trying to gather the courage to walk up those 3 concrete steps and knock on the door. A teenage boy came out at one point, basketball under his arm, heading down the street without looking back. One of Sophia's sons, I assumed. Marcus's nephew. The boy had dark hair and walked with a loose-limbed confidence that reminded me painfully of Marcus in the old photos I'd found, the ones from before he became Marcus Webb. I finally forced myself out of the car and walked to the door. My hand was shaking as I pressed the doorbell. I could hear it chiming inside, followed by footsteps and a woman's voice calling out that she was coming. The door opened, and I found myself face to face with Sophia Romano. She was smaller than I'd expected, barely 5 feet tall, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore scrubs with cartoon characters on them, clearly getting ready for her shift at the hospital. Her eyes were dark brown and tired but kind. The kind of eyes that had seen a lot of pain but hadn't let it make her bitter. Can I help you? Her voice had a distinct Philadelphia accent, the kind Marcus had worked so hard to erase from his own speech. I'm Claire Webb, I said, and watched her face for any sign of recognition. There was none. My husband was Marcus Webb. He passed away last week, and he left something for you. Sophia's expression shifted to confusion. I'm sorry for your loss, but I think you have the wrong person. I don't know anyone named Marcus Webb. I pulled out the letter Marcus had written, the one sealed in the envelope with her name on it. But you knew Marcus Castellano. You were his sister. The color drained from Sophia's face. She grabbed the doorframe like she needed it to stay upright. Her mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to whisper, "That's not possible. Marcus died 27 years ago. There was a fire. They found his body. He's alive. Or he was alive until last week." I held out the envelope. "He's been watching over you all these years, Sophia. He's the one who's been sending you money. He's the anonymous benefactor. Every dollar came from him." Sophia took the envelope with trembling hands, staring at her name written in handwriting she must have recognized, even after nearly 3 decades. "This is Marcus's handwriting. How is this possible?" "I don't know if I should come in or if you want me to leave," I said. "But I have a lot to tell you, and I think you're going to want to sit down when you hear it." Sophia stepped back and opened the door wider, her face still pale with shock. "Please come in. I need to understand what's happening." The inside of Sophia's house was exactly what I'd expected. Religious icons on every wall. Family photos covering every surface. The kind of home that valued tradition and connection. Everything Marcus had given up when he became someone else. Sophia led me to a small living room and gestured for me to sit on a worn sofa while she lowered herself into an armchair, still clutching the unopened letter. "Start from the beginning," she said. "Tell me everything." So I did. I told her about meeting Marcus Webb 26 years ago, about falling in love with a man who seemed to have no family and no past. I told her about building a life together, about the business ventures and the modest successes and the quiet happiness of a marriage I'd thought was built on trust. I told her about finding the letter 3 days after his funeral, about learning that my husband had a sister he'd been supporting in secret for more than 2 decades. I told her about the $400,000 he'd sent to her over the years, money that came from our joint accounts without my knowledge or consent. Sophia listened without interrupting, tears streaming down her face. When I finished, she looked down at the letter in her hands and said, "He never forgot me. For 27 years I thought he was dead. I thought he'd died in that fire and I'd never see him again. I went to the funeral. I watched them bury a casket that I guess was empty. And all that time he was alive." She looked up at me with eyes full of pain and confusion. "Why didn't he ever contact me? Why did he let me think he was dead?" "I don't know all the details," I admitted. "But from what I've learned, he was running from something dangerous. He witnessed a murder, something involving your Uncle Vincent. He thought if he stayed, he'd either end up like the man who was killed or become someone just as bad. So he disappeared completely, burned Marcus Castellano to the ground and became someone new." Sophia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Vincent always was a monster. My father too, if I'm being honest. They were part of things that I tried my whole life to stay away from. I became a nurse because I wanted to help people, not hurt them. I wanted to be different from the family business." She laughed, a bitter sound. "I guess Marcus felt the same way." "He felt exactly the same way," I said. "And he loved you enough to sacrifice everything to make sure you were okay. He went to your weddings. He watched your kids grow up from a distance. He sent money every time you needed it. He spent half his life making sure his little sister was safe and cared for, even though he couldn't be there in person." Sophia opened the letter with shaking hands and began to read. I watched her face as she absorbed Marcus's words, whatever private message he'd left for the sister he'd loved from afar. Her expression cycled through shock, grief, anger, understanding, and finally something that looked like acceptance. When she finished, she carefully folded the letter and held it against her chest. "He says he's sorry. He says he watched me all these years and he's proud of the person I became. He says the money was never about obligation, it was about love. He says he hopes I can forgive him for letting me believe he was dead, but he couldn't risk bringing danger to my door." She looked at me with fresh tears in her eyes. "He says you're the best thing that ever happened to him, and he hopes you'll forgive him too." I felt my own tears start then. The first I'd allowed myself to cry since reading Marcus's confession. I don't know if I can forgive him. He lied to me every single day for 23 years. He stole from our future to give to your past. He built our entire marriage on a foundation of deception. How am I supposed to forgive that? Sophia was quiet for a moment, studying me with those tired, kind eyes. Can I tell you something about my brother? The Marcus I remember before he disappeared? He was the best of us. Our father and uncle, they were violent men who made money hurting people. But Marcus was different. He was gentle. He loved books and music. He used to sneak me ice cream when I was sad and tell me stories about places we'd go someday when we were away from all of this. When he disappeared, I thought I'd lost the only good thing in our family. She set the letter down on the coffee table between us. I'm not saying what he did was right. Lying to you, taking money without your knowledge, that was wrong. But I think I understand why he did it. He was trying to be two people at once. The man who escaped his past and the brother who couldn't completely abandon his family. That's an impossible thing to do. And eventually, the impossibility of it would have destroyed him even if the aneurysm hadn't. Maybe that's what the aneurysm was, I said quietly. The impossibility of living two lives finally catching up with him. We sat in silence for a few minutes. Two women connected by a man who'd loved us both but couldn't figure out how to do it honestly. Finally, Sophia spoke again. What happens now? With the money, with everything? I've been thinking about that question for 3 days. I pulled out the financial documents Richard Chun had given me and spread them across Sophia's coffee table. This is everything Marcus sent you over the past 23 years. $467,000 total. Money that came from accounts we shared. Money that should have been part of our future together. Sophia stared at the documents, her face going pale. That much? I had no idea it was that much. I thought it was maybe 20 or 30,000 over all those years. I didn't know. The lawyer made it seem like it was just a small amount from someone who'd known our family. You don't have to pay it back, I said, and was surprised to hear myself mean it. That money is gone. Marcus gave it to you because he loved you, and taking it back now won't change anything that happened. It won't make him less dead or make the lies any less painful. But Sophia started and I held up my hand. But nothing. You needed that money and you used it to take care of your family. That's what it was meant for. I'm not going to punish you for Marcus's choices. What I am going to do is tell you the truth about something. Sophia's hand instinctively went to her chest, like she was bracing for another blow. Marcus set up a trust fund for your children. Another $300,000 that he put away over the years, money he earned legitimately through his business. That money is legally yours now, designated for your kids' college education. Richard Chun has all the documentation. Sophia's eyes widened. $300,000? For my kids? But why would he? Because he loved them even though he never met them, I said. Because he was their uncle and he wanted to make sure they had opportunities he never had. Because despite all his lies and all his mistakes, Marcus Webb truly believed family was worth any sacrifice. Even sacrificing his own happiness. Sophia started crying again, deep sobs that shook her small frame. I let her cry without trying to comfort her. Some grief is too personal to share, even between people connected by loss. When she finally composed herself, she looked at me with something like wonder. You didn't have to come here. You didn't have to tell me any of this. You could have just let me keep believing the money came from some anonymous friend, kept Marcus's secret even after he died. Why did you tell me the truth? I took a deep breath, trying to put into words something I was just beginning to understand myself. Because I spent 23 years living with lies, and I'm done with that. Because you deserve to know that you had a brother who loved you, even if he loved you from a distance. And because I needed to meet you to see the person who was worth all those lies, to understand what Marcus was willing to sacrifice everything for. I stood up, suddenly exhausted from the emotional weight of the past few days. I should go. You probably need time to process all of this, and I have a long drive back to Cleveland. Sophia stood too, then did something I didn't expect. She hugged me, this tiny woman who just learned her brother had been alive for 27 years, wrapping her arms around the wife he'd lied to for most of their marriage. Thank you for coming. Thank you for telling me the truth. Thank you for not hating me even though you'd have every right to. I don't hate you, I said, and realized it was true. You didn't do anything wrong. You were just living your life, taking care of your family, doing the best you could. None of this is your fault. As I walked back to my car, I felt something shift inside me. The anger was still there, the sense of betrayal, the grief for the marriage I'd thought I had. But underneath all of that was something else. Understanding, maybe. Or at least the beginning of understanding. Marcus had made terrible choices, but they'd been motivated by love. Complicated, impossible, destructive love, but love nonetheless. I drove back to Cleveland as the sun set, turning the highway into ribbons of gold and shadow. Somewhere behind me was Philadelphia, where Sophia Romano would spend the evening rereading her brother's letter and trying to reconcile 27 years of grief with the knowledge that he'd been watching over her all along. Somewhere ahead was the house I'd shared with Marcus Webb, full of his belongings and his secrets and the ghost of a marriage that had never been quite what I'd believed it was. But somewhere in between, somewhere in the miles of highway that separated what I'd learned from what I'd believed, I started thinking about what came next. About the choices I had now that the truth was finally out in the open. About the kind of life I wanted to build from the ruins of the one Marcus's lies had destroyed. Mrs. Chun had been right. Being angry at a dead man wouldn't change anything. But deciding what to do with the truth he'd left behind, that was something I could control. That was something I could choose. And for the first time since finding that letter in Marcus's desk, I felt like maybe eventually I could choose something other than grief. I could choose something that looked almost like forgiveness. Not for Marcus's sake, but for my own. Because carrying the weight of his lies was exhausting, and I was tired of carrying weight that wasn't mine. It was time to put it down. Time to start over. Time to figure out who Claire Webb was when she wasn't defined by her husband's deceptions. The drive stretched out ahead of me, full of possibilities I hadn't yet imagined. And for the first time in days I was ready to imagine them. I spent the next 3 weeks sorting through Marcus's belongings with a methodical precision that surprised even me. Every drawer, every box, every forgotten corner of our house yielded new evidence of the double life he'd maintained. I found receipts from restaurants in Philadelphia tucked into jacket pockets. Train tickets he'd told me were for business trips to Columbus. A photograph of Sophia's children at a playground, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens, hidden inside a book about Italian architecture that I'd never seen him read. Each discovery felt like pulling back another layer of deception, revealing depths to Marcus's lies that I hadn't imagined possible. But something strange was happening as I uncovered more and more evidence of his secret life. The anger I'd expected to grow was actually diminishing, replaced by something more complicated. Sadness for the man who'd lived in such constant fear. Pity for the isolation he must have felt, unable to share his true self with anyone. And underneath it all, a growing understanding of the impossible situation he'd created for himself when he was barely more than a kid. Mrs. Chun came over most afternoons, helping me sort and pack and decide what to keep and what to let go. She never asked intrusive questions, never pushed me to talk before I was ready. But her presence was a comfort, a reminder that life continued even after the foundations you built it on turned out to be sand. One afternoon, as we were boxing up Marcus's clothes to donate to the local shelter, she said something that stopped me cold. You know what the hardest part was for me? After I found out about Robert's other family? It wasn't the betrayal or the lies. It was realizing that I'd never really known him at all. That the man I'd been married to for 31 years was a stranger wearing a familiar face. I sat down on the bed, holding one of Marcus's shirts. But you moved past it. You built a new life. How did you do that? She smiled, but it was tinged with remembered pain. I stopped trying to figure out who Robert really was and started figuring out who I really was without him. That's the only way forward, Claire. You have to decide who you want to be now that you're not Marcus Webb's wife anymore. The question haunted me for days. Who was Claire Webb without Marcus? I'd given up my journalism career to support his business ventures. I'd moved to Cleveland because that's where his opportunities were. I'd structured my entire adult life around being his partner, his supporter, his wife. Now that the foundation of that identity was gone, what was left? I started small. I took out my old journalism notebooks, the ones I'd kept from before I married Marcus, when I was covering local politics and city council meetings and the small stories that revealed the larger truths about communities. I read through my old articles, surprised by the voice I heard in them. Sharp, curious, unafraid to ask difficult questions. That woman felt like someone I'd known once but had gradually lost touch with over 26 years of marriage. I wanted to find her again. I called my old editor at the Cleveland Plain Dealer, a woman named Janet Morrison who tried to recruit me several times over the years. Each time I told her I was too busy supporting Marcus's business, that maybe someday when things settled down. Janet answered on the third ring, and when I told her who I was, her voice brightened immediately. Claire Webb. I was so sorry to hear about your husband. How are you holding up? I'm calling about those job offers you used to make, I said, deciding to be direct. Are you still looking for experienced journalists? There was a pause. Then Janet's voice came back with barely contained excitement. Are you serious? After all these years of turning me down, you're actually interested? Things have changed, I said, which was possibly the understatement of the century. I'm ready to get back to work. I'm ready to tell stories again. We met for coffee the next day at a cafe downtown. Janet was exactly as I remembered, sharp-eyed and direct. With gray hair she'd stopped dyeing years ago and an energy that made people half her age look tired. She listened as I explained that I'd been out of journalism for over 2 decades, but that I was ready to jump back in, ready to work whatever hours she needed, ready to prove I could still do the job. Here's what I'm thinking, Janet said, stirring sugar into her coffee. I need someone to cover human interest stories. Not the fluff pieces but real investigations into how policy affects actual people. Housing displacement, healthcare access, immigration issues. The kind of work that takes time and relationship building and the ability to get people to trust you with their stories. It's exactly what you used to be good at before you left. I felt something flutter in my chest. Something that might have been hope or excitement, or just the terrifying prospect of starting over. When would I start? Monday if you're ready. It doesn't pay what it should, but it's steady work and you'll have the freedom to chase the stories that matter. I said yes before I could overthink it. By the time I left that cafe, I had a job, a desk waiting for me at the newspaper office, and a list of potential story leads. Janet wanted me to explore. For the first time since finding Marcus's letter, I felt like I had a purpose that was entirely my own. The work was harder than I'd expected. I'd forgotten how exhausting it was to chase down sources, to make phone call after phone call until someone finally agreed to talk. I'd forgotten the particular frustration of watching good stories fall apart because key witnesses refused to go on record. But I'd also forgotten the satisfaction of finally breaking through someone's defenses, of hearing them tell you the truth they'd been holding inside, of writing sentences that actually mattered. 3 weeks into the job, I was investigating a story about elderly residents being pushed out of their apartments by developers who wanted to convert the buildings into luxury condos. It was exactly the kind of David versus Goliath story I used to love, complete with villainous landlords and sympathetic victims who deserved better than what they were getting. One of my sources was an 82-year-old woman named Ruth Kowalski, who'd lived in the same apartment for 47 years. She invited me over for tea and spent 2 hours telling me about her life, about the neighborhood she'd watched change, about the friends she'd lost to death or displacement, about her terror of losing the only home she'd known for nearly half a century. As she talked, I found myself thinking about Sophia Romano, about the way Marcus had tried to protect her from losing her home, about the complicated morality of taking money you hadn't earned to help someone you loved. Mrs. Kowalski, I said carefully when she'd finished her story, if you found out someone you loved had been lying to you for years, but they'd done it to protect you, would you be able to forgive them? She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. This isn't really about my apartment situation, is it, dear? No, I admitted. It's about my late husband. I just found out he'd been keeping enormous secrets from me for our entire marriage. Ruth reached across her small kitchen table and patted my hand. Let me tell you something I learned when my Stanley died. Men are complicated creatures. They think they're protecting us when really they're just protecting themselves from having to face difficult conversations. But here's the thing, whatever your husband lied about, it doesn't change the good moments you had together. Those were real, even if the foundation was shaky. The question isn't whether you can forgive him. He's gone. He doesn't need your forgiveness. The question is whether you can forgive yourself for not seeing through the lies sooner. Her words stayed with me as I wrote her story, as I interviewed other residents and documented the pattern of displacement happening across the neighborhood. They stayed with me when the story ran on the front page of the Sunday paper, and the city council called an emergency meeting to address the issue. They stayed with me when Ruth called to thank me, crying on the phone because someone had finally listened to her, finally believed that her story mattered. That night, I sat in Marcus's old office, which I'd started thinking of as just the office, and opened my laptop. I started writing not for the newspaper but for myself. I wrote about meeting Marcus Webb 26 years ago. About falling in love with his kindness and his quiet strength. I wrote about building a life together. About the small moments of happiness that had felt so real at the time. I wrote about finding the letter and learning the truth. About the devastation of discovering that the foundation of my marriage had been built on lies. But I also wrote about meeting Sophia. About understanding why Marcus had sacrificed so much to protect her. I wrote about starting to work again. About rediscovering the parts of myself I put aside to be someone's wife. I wrote about the complicated reality that it was possible to be betrayed by someone and still love them. To be angry about the lies and still grateful for the genuine moments of connection. I wrote until the sun came up, until my fingers ached and my eyes burned. And when I finally stopped, I had something that looked like the beginning of understanding, if not quite forgiveness. 2 months after returning to journalism, I got a call from Richard Chun. His voice on the phone was carefully neutral, the way it had been during our first meeting. "Mrs. Webb, I wanted to update you on some developments regarding Marcus's estate. There's been an inquiry." My stomach tightened. "What kind of inquiry?" "The FBI has been in touch. They're closing out some old cases related to the Castellano family, and Marcus's name came up in their records. They know he faked his death. They know about the money he took from his uncle's operation. They want to talk to you about what you knew and when you knew it." I closed my eyes, feeling the careful stability I'd been building start to crack. I didn't know anything until after he died. I have the letter he left, the documentation that proves I was completely in the dark. I understand, and I've explained that to them. But they'd still like to meet with you officially. They're also reaching out to Sophia. The FBI wants to know if either of you have information about the murder Marcus witnessed before he disappeared. The murder. I'd almost managed to forget about that part of Marcus's confession, about the fact that he'd watched someone die and never reported it. If he was still alive, would they charge him? With being an accessory after the fact, almost certainly. He witnessed a federal crime and fled instead of testifying. That's obstruction of justice at minimum. But he's not alive, so they're just trying to close the case file. As long as neither you nor Sophia have additional information about what happened, this should be fairly straightforward. I met with the FBI agents the following week in a conference room at their Cleveland field office. They were younger than I'd expected. A man and a woman in their 30s who looked at me with more sympathy than suspicion. They asked careful questions about when I'd learned about Marcus's real identity, about what he'd told me, about whether I had any knowledge of the Castellano family operations or the murder Marcus had witnessed. I answered honestly, showing them the letter Marcus had left, explaining that I'd spent 26 years believing I was married to Marcus Webb from Columbus, Ohio, a man with no family and no complicated past. They seemed satisfied with my answers, though the female agent, whose name was Morrison, said something as the interview was ending that made my blood run cold. "Your husband was lucky, Mrs. Webb. If he'd lived, if the Castellano family had discovered he was alive, they would have killed him. Probably would have killed you too, just to make a point. By faking his death and disappearing completely, he saved both your lives." The thought hadn't occurred to me before, not really. I'd been so focused on the betrayal, on the lies, that I hadn't fully considered what might have happened if Marcus had tried to maintain contact with his old life. If he'd been less thorough in erasing Marcus Castellano, if he'd slipped up even once, Vincent Castellano would have found him. And people like Vincent Castellano didn't forgive betrayal. On my way out of the FBI office, I called Sophia. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with stress. "The FBI just left my house. They were asking about Marcus, about what I remember from before he disappeared." "What did you tell them?" "Nothing useful. I was 16 when he left. I didn't know anything about what he was mixed up in, and I still don't. They seem to believe me, but Claire, this is terrifying. What if asking questions about Marcus brings attention to my family? What if someone from the old neighborhood starts wondering why the FBI is suddenly interested in a man who died 27 years ago?" She was right to be worried. The Castellano organization might be dismantled, but that didn't mean everyone connected to it had forgotten. There were long memories in that world, and Marcus's betrayal, taking money and disappearing, would be the kind of thing people remembered. "I'll call Richard Chun," I said. "He'll know how to handle this, how to make sure the FBI keeps this quiet. In the meantime, just go about your normal life." Don't talk to anyone about Marcus or the family. If anyone asks questions, refer them to the lawyer. Okay. Sophia's voice was small, frightened. Claire, I'm scared. So am I admitted. But Marcus kept us both safe for 27 years. We're going to keep ourselves safe now. After I hung up, I sat in my car in the FBI parking lot and let myself feel the full weight of what Marcus had done. Not just the lying, though that was bad enough, but the protection. He'd built an entire false identity to keep himself safe, and in doing so, he'd kept Sophia and me safe too. He'd carried the weight of his family's violence alone, never letting it touch either of us. The sacrifice of that was staggering. I drove to the cemetery where Marcus was buried, something I hadn't done since the funeral. His grave was in a quiet section under a maple tree, the headstone simple and clean. Marcus Webb, beloved husband, 1972 to 2024. No mention of Marcus Castellano. No acknowledgement of the life he'd lived before he became the man I married. I sat down on the grass beside the grave, not caring that it was damp from recent rain. Marcus, I said out loud, feeling foolish but needing to say the words anyway. I understand now. I don't forgive you for lying to me. I don't think I ever will. But I understand why you did it. I understand that you were trying to protect me from something I couldn't even imagine. I understand that every lie was also a kind of love, even if it was a love that hurt me. The wind rustled through the maple leaves above me, and for just a moment, I could almost pretend it was Marcus answering, telling me he was sorry, telling me he'd loved me the best way he knew how. I pulled out my phone and called Janet Morrison at the paper. When she answered, I said, I want to write a story. Not about Marcus specifically, but about people who reinvent themselves to escape dangerous pasts. About witness protection and false identities and the cost of starting over. About what it means to build a life on a foundation of necessary lies. It's a first-person piece, Janet said immediately, understanding what I was really asking. You want to write about your own experience. Parts of it, yes. With names changed, details obscured. But I think there are other people out there living with these kinds of secrets, and maybe they need to know they're not alone. Maybe their families need to understand why the lies were necessary. Write it, Janet said. Write whatever you need to write. If it's good, we'll run it. If it's too personal, we'll figure out another way to tell the story. But write it, Claire. I think you need to. She was right. I spent the next 2 weeks writing and rewriting, trying to find the balance between honesty and discretion, between telling my truth and protecting Sophia's privacy. The piece that finally emerged was about the children of organized crime families, about the ones who wanted out but had no clean way to leave, about the false identities and the constant fear in the families left behind who never knew what happened to the people they loved. The paper ran it as a Sunday feature with the headline, The Ghosts We Become, Life After Leaving. My byline was at the top, Claire Webb, and seeing it there felt like reclaiming something I'd lost. The response was immediate and overwhelming. I got emails from people all over the country who'd lived through similar situations. Children of criminals who'd had to change their names and disappear. Spouses who discovered their partners had secret pasts. Social workers and therapists who dealt with the aftermath of these fractured identities. But the email that mattered most came from Sophia. She wrote, "Thank you for telling our story without telling our story. Thank you for helping me understand that Marcus's lies weren't just about protecting himself. They were about protecting all of us from a world we were lucky enough to escape. I'm still angry that he never told me he was alive. I'm still sad about all the years we lost. But I'm also grateful that he loved me enough to watch over me from a distance. That's complicated and messy, and maybe it doesn't make sense, but it's the truth. The truth is complicated and messy. That was something I was learning to accept. 4 months after finding Marcus's letter, I moved out of the house we'd shared. Not because I couldn't stand to be there, but because I needed a space that was entirely mine, not haunted by memories of a marriage built on deception. I found a small apartment downtown close to the newspaper office, with big windows that let in light and a view of the city that felt full of possibility. Mrs. Chan helped me move, packing boxes and offering opinions on furniture placement with the authority of someone who'd done this before. On my first night in the new apartment, she brought over Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine. We sat on my new couch, eating lo mein out of containers and talking about everything except Marcus and Robert and the husbands who'd lied to us. Felt like freedom. The next morning, I woke up in a bed that had never been Marcus's, in a room he'd never seen, in a life that was entirely my own creation. I made coffee in a kitchen where every cup and plate and utensil was exactly where I wanted it. I didn't have to work around someone else's habits or preferences or secrets. For the first time in 26 years, I was just Claire. Not Claire Webb, Marcus's wife. Not Claire the journalist who gave up her career. Just Claire figuring out who she wanted to be. I spent that Saturday exploring my new neighborhood, finding the best coffee shop and the closest library, and the park where people walk their dogs in the morning. I introduced myself to my neighbors without mentioning that I was a widow, without offering the tragic backstory that had defined me for months. I was just a woman who'd moved into apartment 4B, who worked at the newspaper, who was starting over. At the park, I sat on a bench and watched families playing with their children. A father was teaching his daughter to ride a bike, running alongside her with his hand on the seat, letting go for brief moments before catching her again when she wobbled. The girl was laughing, delighted by the rush of almost independence, not yet aware of how many times she'd fall before she learned to balance on her own. That's what I was doing, I realized. Learning to balance without Marcus's hand on the seat. Learning that falling was part of the process, not a sign of failure. Learning that independence was worth the scraped knees and the moments of fear when you realized no one was catching you anymore. My phone buzzed with a text from Janet. Got a tip about nursing home abuse in Lakewood. Interested? I texted back immediately. Send me the details. I'll start Monday. This was my life now. Not the one I'd planned when I married Marcus Webb 26 years ago. Not the one I'd imagined when I thought I knew who my husband was and what our future held. But it was mine, built on a foundation of truth instead of lies, constructed from the pieces of the person I used to be and the person I was becoming. 6 months after finding Marcus's letter, I went back to Philadelphia. Not to see Richard Chan or to chase down more secrets about Marcus's past, but to have dinner with Sophia. She'd invited me weeks earlier, saying her children wanted to meet the woman their uncle had married. The woman who'd helped them understand why the anonymous money had suddenly stopped and then started again in a different form. Sophia's house looked different in the evening light, warmer somehow. She answered the door wearing jeans and a sweater instead of her nursing scrubs, looking younger and more relaxed than she had during our first meeting. Her 3 children were gathered in the living room, eyeing me with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "This is Claire," Sophia said, gesturing for me to come in. "She was married to your uncle Marcus. I want you all to be polite and welcoming because without her, you wouldn't have college funds and I wouldn't understand why my brother disappeared." The evening was awkward at first, the way family gatherings with strangers always are. But gradually, as we ate Sophia's lasagna and her children asked careful questions about Marcus, something shifted. They wanted to know what he was like. This uncle they'd never met who'd been watching over them from a distance. I told them stories, carefully editing out the parts about lies and deception, focusing instead on Marcus's kindness, his quiet generosity, his tendency to remember small details about people and follow up weeks later. I told them about the way he'd loved their mother enough to give up everything to keep her safe. Sophia's oldest son, Michael, who was 19 and studying engineering at Temple, said something that made tears spring to my eyes. It sounds like Uncle Marcus was trying to be the person he wished his own father had been. He was trying to break the cycle. "That's exactly what he was doing," I said. "And he succeeded. You 3 are proof of that. You're going to college. You're building good lives. You're nothing like the family Marcus came from, and that's what he wanted more than anything." After dinner, after the kids had cleared the table and disappeared to do homework, Sophia and I sat on her front steps drinking coffee and watching the neighborhood settle into night. "Do you think you'll ever forgive him?" she asked quietly. "I don't know," I admitted. "Some days I think I already have. Other days I'm so angry I can barely breathe. But I'm learning to live with both of those things being true at the same time. I'm learning that forgiveness isn't a destination you arrive at. It's more like a direction you choose to walk in." Sophia nodded, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug. "I spent 27 years being angry at Marcus for abandoning me. Now I have to relearn all those years knowing he never abandoned me at all. I don't know which version of the past is real anymore. Maybe they both are," I suggested. "Maybe he did abandon you by faking his death. And he also never left you because he was always watching over you. Maybe that's just the reality of loving someone who was stuck in an impossible situation. Before I left that night, Sophia gave me a photograph. It was old, faded at the edges, showing two children on a beach somewhere. The boy was maybe 10, the girl 7 or 8. They were building a sandcastle together, both grinning at the camera with gap-toothed smiles. "This is the only picture I have of Marcus and me together as kids," Sophia said. "I want you to have it. I want you to know that before he was Marcus Webb, before all the lies and the fear and the running, he was just my brother. He was just a kid who built sandcastles with me and made me laugh when our father was in one of his moods. That person was real too." I took the photograph, studying the face of the boy who would grow up to be Marcus Castellano, then Marcus Webb, then my husband. "You can see it in his eyes even then," Sophia said softly. "That gentleness. That desire to protect people. He was already trying to take care of me even when we were kids." I drove back to Cleveland with that photograph on my passenger seat. When I got home to my apartment, I didn't hide it away or add it to a box of Marcus's belongings I couldn't bring myself to unpack. Instead, I put it on my refrigerator, held up by a magnet shaped like a tiny house. A reminder that people are complicated. That the man who lied to me was also the boy who built sandcastles with his little sister. That both versions were true, even when they contradicted each other. 1 year after finding Marcus's letter, I sat in Ruth Kowalski's kitchen drinking tea and listening to her tell me about her grandson's graduation from medical school. The story I'd written about the apartment displacement had led to a city ordinance protecting elderly tenants, and Ruth was still in her home, still surrounded by 47 years of memories. "You did that," she said, pointing a gnarled finger at me. "You told my story and people listened. That's what good journalism does," I said, but she shook her head. "No, dear. That's what good people do. They listen when others have been ignored for too long." I thought about that as I walked back to my car. About the year I'd spent rebuilding my life after Marcus's death. I'd returned to journalism and found that I was better at it now than I'd been before, more patient with sources, more willing to sit with complicated truths. I'd built relationships with people like Ruth who reminded me that everyone had stories worth telling, lives worth honoring. I'd learned to live alone without being lonely, to find satisfaction in my own company, to stop defining myself through my relationship to someone else. That evening I wrote one final piece about Marcus. Not for publication, just for myself. I wrote about the impossible calculus of loving someone who'd lied to you, about the way betrayal and devotion could exist in the same relationship, about the messy reality that people could hurt you deeply while also protecting you fiercely. I wrote about forgiveness not as an event but as a practice, something you chose every day even when it felt impossible. I wrote about the version of Marcus who'd built our life together in Cleveland, and the version who'd watched over Sophia from a distance, and the version who'd been a scared 24-year-old trying to escape a world that would have destroyed him. I wrote about learning to hold all those versions in my mind at once, accepting that the man I'd married was all of them and none of them, that the truth was bigger and more complicated than any single narrative could contain. When I finished writing, I read what I'd written and realized something that made my chest ache with recognition. I'd spent a year being angry at Marcus for creating a false identity, for building a life on lies. But I'd been doing the same thing. For 26 years, I'd created a false identity as Marcus Webb's wife, as the woman who supported his dreams at the expense of her own. I'd built a life on the lie that I was happy being defined entirely by my relationship to someone else. Marcus's deception had forced me to face my own. His lies had revealed the truth I'd been avoiding, that I'd given up pieces of myself I never should have surrendered. And now, finally, I was reclaiming them. The next morning I went back to the cemetery one last time. I sat by Marcus's grave and told him everything I'd learned. About the journalism work I was doing. About my friendship with Sophia and her children. About the apartment downtown and the life I was building that was entirely my own. I told him I understood now why he'd lied. And that understanding didn't erase the hurt, but it made it bearable. I told him I was learning to forgive him slowly and perfectly, one day at a time. And I told him goodbye. Not the angry goodbye I'd wanted to give him when I first learned the truth. Not the tearful goodbye I'd said at his funeral when I still believed in the fiction of Marcus Webb. But a genuine goodbye, accepting him as he really was, complicated and flawed and human. A goodbye that acknowledged all the versions of him I'd known and all the versions I'd never know. A goodbye that released both of us from the weight of expectations and lies. As I walked back to my car, I felt lighter than I had in months. The grief was still there, but it had transformed into something I could carry without it crushing me. The anger was still there too, but it had been joined by understanding and acceptance and the beginning of peace. I drove back to my apartment, to the life I was building one honest day at a time. I had a story to write for the paper, a dinner plan with Mrs. Chan, a phone call scheduled with Sophia to check on how her youngest was doing in school. I had a full life that was entirely mine, built on a foundation of truth instead of lies. And for the first time since finding that letter in Marcus's desk, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. Not in the life I'd planned, but in the life I'd chosen. Not as someone's wife or someone's victim, but as myself fully and completely. That was the gift Marcus's lies had given me, though he'd never intended it. By destroying the foundation of our marriage, he'd forced me to build a new one entirely on my own terms. By showing me who he really was, he'd forced me to figure out who I really was too. And the person I discovered in the ruins of my marriage was someone I actually liked. Someone strong and honest and capable of carrying complicated truths. Someone who could hold anger and love in the same hand without letting either one define her completely. Someone who was learning finally to be free. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.